Good morning, everybody, and good morning to everybody online. I'm a bit nervous following Caroline. Caroline is a political hero of mine. I've been in the environment field for over 20 years now, and people like Caroline deserve a lot of praise for really pushing the environmental agenda, not just here in Britain, but across Europe and the world generally. And I'm absolutely delighted that she, along with Dominic, have taken over the chair roles here at the European Movement. Now, I was given the brief of talking about the environmental impacts of leaving the European Union. And I think it's fair to say it's still relatively early days in the broad sweep of history, but there are already concerning developments. Some that have emerged already, some that are emerging. But before I go on to that, I'd just like to talk a little bit, maybe go backwards in time and just talk about, first of all, how the membership of the European Union for Britain really benefited us on the environment and how it helped to push forward environmental policy. So I am going to first of all quote who I think is one of the godfathers of British environmental policy. He's a mentor of mine. He's a former director and founder of the London office of my institute, the Institute for European Environmental Policy, Nigel Haig, OBE. He wrote a book back in 1984 where he quotes, "British environmental policy is a deeply rooted plant which over the last 10 years has shown fresh growth under a new stimulus." Now, he was talking at a time when the UK, having joined what was then the EEC in 1972, or rather the 1st of January 1973, he was talking about our membership of the European community. And Nigel was also talking about the Industrial Revolution. He was talking about the fact that the Industrial Revolution started here in Britain, but that also meant severe environmental damage and degradation started here too. But on the flip side, policies to try and manage and limit that degradation also started here too. So we have, of course, had made some improvements before we joined the EEC and the EU, but of course, that was we had made some progress towards that, but change really only began to start happening after we joined. Now, some may, of course, argue that things may have changed anyway, even if we hadn't have been a member of the EEC or the EU. But some people might argue that perhaps our membership of international agreements that was beginning to proliferate in the latter half of the 20th century might have helped us to develop our environmental policy. But these are not quite the same as or as influential as the membership of the European Union with its huge political and policy-making machinery. Of course, the European Union is a very big player economically and a very big player diplomatically, and it's of course a truism, as Caroline said, that environment knows no bounds. It doesn't respect national boundaries. And also, the EU and its precursors are able to achieve results on environment and environmental policy in a way that no one member country can achieve on its own. Environmental protection is set down in its treaties, in its core primary legislation, which is, of course, very, very hard to change. And this is a real big benefit. because it meant that standards set by secondary laws that the EU member states, the 27 member states now, are far less likely to pull these things apart by perhaps short-term interests of individual groups of politicians or in the short-term interests of individual parliaments. The EU is also very good at setting numerical targets and processes down in its legislation. It's very good at setting time-bound, measurable things within its legislation. And this is something that Britain, before we joined the EEC, was not very good at doing. We were very vague and very woolly in our language. We were very woolly in our language, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. This was partly because the European Commission is wanting to be a check on member states, to be able to ensure that member states are doing the right thing. But it's very good for accountability because NGOs and civil society too can hold our governments and our leaders to account through very open and transparent information. Now, talking about accountability, the European Union also obviously has very strong institutions. The European Commission, backed up by the Court of Justice, with its very, very big sticks, its ability to fine member states is, of course, a very good way of pushing member states to do things and to make sure that countries like Britain was holding its end of the bargain. But of course, also the EU is very good at pooling resources, pooling sovereignty, not detracting away from it, but pooling it all together. And it's also very good at pulling together experts across a whole range of different fields and expertise in a way that no single country can hope to achieve. Now, I'm not somebody who is wholly without any criticism whatsoever of the European Union. There are things that it does that are not good, and it can, of course, be a lot better on the environment. I do not pretend otherwise, but on the whole, Britain has been far better off being a member of the European Union and having had this experience than if we weren't a part of it at all. And the EU have also learned from Britain during this time. So, and we mustn't forget that things, really core bits of legislation around the Water Framework Directive and the Waste Framework Directive, really key bits of river basin management plans and waste plans. These are things that originated here in Britain and which influenced the direction of environmental policy around Europe. So bringing us back to the present, now that we're outside of the EU, I think some people are beginning to ask, will we become the dirty man of Europe again? Now, this was a term that was thrown around in the early 1970s. A lot of countries were worried about Britain and the things that we did and the attitude that we had to environmental policy. It's, of course, perhaps very understandable that we are worried about becoming the dirty man of Europe again, because as we see sewage rife in our freshwaters, in our lakes and in our rivers, it's on our beaches, horrible, disgusting scenes, and people are obviously getting sick. And of course, we're a very nature depleted country, and something that we really need to do something about, of course. At IEEP, the Institute for European Environmental Policy, we have been studying this divergence, this change in legislation since Brexit. When we left the European Union, we had essentially the same rule book. And over time, we are starting to diverge from one another. And we're looking at this in different ways, through different lenses. So we're looking at UK law changing and leading to differences with the European Union. We're looking at EU law changing and leading to differences with the UK. But we're also looking at it in terms of changes in the way in which the UK implements and enforces law here in the UK too. And this is broadly what we've found so far. And of course, the story's not over and it's ever changing. It's a very dynamic situation. Generally speaking, and of course, there's lots of caveats in this, what we found is that the EU is moving ahead. It's become a much more progressive policy maker on environment. And on the other hand, the UK has tended towards moving much more slowly. It's tended to have a much lower level of ambition, and it's tended to have a much less stringent approach to regulation. Now, of course, depending on which particular areas of policy, these things are changing, and also depending on which part of the UK, which nation of the United Kingdom you're looking at, these things are slightly different. But what we're seeing is generally that. Now, just a word about the European Union, and I know that Mark very eloquently talked about this in his speech before. The Green Deal, maybe many of you have heard about this, the European Green Deal was implemented by the last Commission of Ursula von der Leyen, and notionally it's still underway, it's still being implemented. But what we're starting to see is a green lash, a sort of backlash against some of these policies. And Mark was referring to this. We've seen a watering down of a lot of policies, a wafer-thin margins of certain EU policies in the European Parliament were observed. So some environmental laws only just squeaked through when in previous years we would have seen quite large majorities. The rise of net zero skeptics, as Mark talked about, across the European Union, within member states, but also at the European level, is very concerning. And a lot of people in these countries are openly anti-net zero and anti-environmental policy, and that's very concerning. And they are also being cheered on, perhaps, by the new United States president, who, again, is very clearly anti-environment and anti-climate. I was reading just earlier this week the fact that he signed into law an executive order about plastic straws. He wanted to bring back plastic straws. Fantastic, isn't that great? Yes, very, very, very good. So, sorry, there's no sarcasm there at all. Let me talk about some specifics on environmental policy, areas in which the European Union has actually taken forward progressive environmental policy. Caroline talked about chemicals, and that's really probably the most clear example. It's a very good case because Michael Gove, he was the Environment Secretary at the time, he said that we would have the best chemical system once we left the European Union. Now, of course, it was all rhetoric, you know, and I'm not going to spoil the story by saying, no, we've not ended up having the best system. We have ended up having a much worse system. What we've found with REACH, which is this regulatory framework that has been established, in some part to try and mirror what the European Union has, and which the UK was a part of when we were part of the European Union, we found that there has been a lack of capacity at regulatory bodies like the Health and Safety Executive. There is a lack of data and transparency over chemical safety information. And don't take my word for this. This is the National Audit Office saying these things. There's fewer and weaker protections. Now, Caroline mentioned some of the statistics, and just to add to that, a further 24 files for restricting chemicals have been started by the EU, only 3 have been started by the UK, one on lead ammunition, one on harmful substances in tattoo ink, and also in PFAS in firefighting foams. But the big headline is that a large number of restrictions of very dangerous chemicals, harmful chemicals, have been restricted by the European Union. Here in the UK, it's 0. And this is because of that lack of capacity. It's really a very concerning situation. And we're still waiting for a chemical strategy 5 years or more after we were promised one. Air quality standards have been tightened by the European Union. They've brought in a new directive to bring the European Union air quality standards much closer to where the World Health Organization suggests we ought to be. Air quality is one of those big silent killers that we really ought to be trying to solve here. And there was a study just last year by the UCL, which said that over 40,000 premature deaths in the UK are linked to air quality. I mean, this is a shocking state of affairs that we really ought to be trying to sort out. On waste and circular economy, the EU is tackling textile and food waste, particularly fast fashion, which you probably know about. Batteries regulation, they're putting in place new rules to set targets for resource and recycling efficiency. On nature, there's been a very big nature restoration law that was passed in the European Union just last year. This was one of those laws that only just squeaked through, but it's a massive bit of legislation. On commodity-driven deforestation, this is a really big piece of legislation the European Union have passed to ban imports of products associated with both legal and illegal deforestation. The UK, or rather England specifically in this case, in its Environment Act of 2021, had a section on it where it would also tackle this issue of commodity-driven deforestation. However, 4 or 5 years later, we're still waiting for secondary legislation to actually put it into effect. So the Shell Act, primary act is there, but we still haven't actually had the actual implementing legislation. And even when it does come in, the plan by the government is only to tackle illegal forest degradation. And that approach relies on good governance, enforcement capabilities, and the legality of deforestation in different countries around the world, like Brazil and Indonesia. So even when it does come in, it won't be as effective as the approach taken by the EU. On climate, the emissions trading scheme has been extended to aviation and shipping, buildings, roads, road transport. The UK has only done a little bit of this. One particular bit of policy that I'm particularly like is around something called the Social Climate Fund. The European Union have put in place basically a pot of money generated by the revenues from the emissions trading scheme to help fund energy efficiency improvements in people's homes, particularly low-income families. On energy efficiency, the EU has passed a law requiring a reduction in the consumption of energy. The UK, check this, this is ridiculous. So we had here in the United Kingdom something called an energy efficiency task force, which was set up to try and tackle this issue of energy efficiency. It was a collection of experts from across industry and academia. Rishi Sunak, as soon as he came into government, scrapped the whole thing. We still don't really know what the government, even the current government's policy on energy efficiency is. Urban wastewater treatment, so sewage. The European Union have also put in place a new law to tighten up standards on sewage. Critical raw materials, I think Mark mentioned something around this. Industrial emissions, the list goes on. These are all things that the EU have done that we haven't always followed suit, or even where we have, we've gone slower and with less ambition. But I don't want you to go away thinking that the EU equals good and the UK equals bad, because there are actually some examples of where the UK has used its new situation to the benefit of the environment. There's not many, but there are some good examples. So you may have seen in the newspapers a few weeks ago a situation around sand eels. Now these are little groups of fish that are relied upon by marine species and by seabirds. And as part of our post-Brexit environmental policy, the UK government banned the fishing of sand eels. An absolutely brilliant decision for the environment, brilliant decision. Now, the European Union, as part of its agreement with the UK, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, has invoked what's called an arbitration panel. Basically, it's taking the UK to court effectively over this, saying that it's unfair to, and it's driven mostly by the French and Danish governments, because they want to keep on fishing these sand eels. And this case is ongoing, and we've really got to hope that the British win on this particular occasion, because this is very important. On agriculture policy, at least in England, we're starting to move more fully away from an area-based payment system and towards one which is public money for public goods. And this is a very good thing. So we're effectively paying farmers and land managers to look after their environment, look after their land in a much more environmentally friendly way. This is something that we have been doing across England more and more over the last few years, even though that there are some issues around the funding linked to that. We've also banned the trade in shark fins, the import and export of shark fins. And there's also something called biodiversity net gain. Some of you may have heard of that already. There is some flaws in this particular policy and some funding concerns, but there are some positive aspects of that. So there are some good examples out there that we have started to put in place, irrespective of our involvement with the European Union. But overall, what we have seen is that the UK has fallen behind on environmental policy. 2 minutes, I'm wrapping up. So there are a few worrying signs. Environmental impact assessment and planning. The government's going for growth at all costs agenda is particularly worrying for nature and for the environment, and also for nutrient neutrality rules. These rules have been put in place for a very good reason, to protect the environment. And we must try and avoid the government riding roughshod over these things. Going forward, environmental principles such as the precautionary principle and the polluter pays principle, in the EU, these were set down in treaties. And here in the UK, we need to make sure that we protect those and make sure that they don't fall foul of the government's going for growth agenda. Scrutiny bodies like the Office for Environmental Protection and Environmental Standards Scotland, these are bodies set up to ensure that the government and its agencies are implementing the law properly, need to be well funded, have the teeth and independence to act. And we need to make sure that they're not at the whim of any one government and any one parliament. Accountability, we need to resist the urge to go back to woolly, vague, discretionary terms in legislation. In the Environment Act, for example, there's a reference to due regard that ministers can exercise their due regard to something, whatever that means. I don't know what that means. And finally, we need to make sure our regulatory agencies have the resources and capacity to do their job and do their job properly. So there are some good things, but there are also some very worrying things, and we need to make sure that we are very mindful of that going forward. Thank you.